The poet William Butler Yeats, that old goat, once said, "Out of the quarrel with others we make rhetoric. Out of the quarrel with ourselves we make poetry." The vast majority of language produced for readers is rhetorical. The news, the trillions of words spilled on social media to convince our friends that we are successful, attractive, good. Literature requires the opposite impulse than this public discourse, requires a very private exploration, not only of the noble, but of the ignoble. So even when you're not writing autobiography or autobiographical fiction, when you're stretching to explore life experiences very different from your own, as I'm frequently doing in The Skin Artist, that act of the imagination is intensely private. It requires a vulnerability that most people would judiciously ignore. Nowhere is this more true than when writing about sexuality, which is such an integral part of life as to seem unavoidable in fiction, especially a book with subject matter like The Skin Artist. To make the intensely private work of the imagination suddenly public, that's what art requires. But nobody writes in a vacuum. I read the news. I compulsively listen to NPR. And so writing about sexuality, and especially about male heterosexual desire in the era of Me Too, required me either to be an idiot or to pay attention to the public discourse. I can only hope that I've let this public discourse help me shape the story so that it's relevant to our times. Neither of my young male protagonists is guilty of sexual assault. I'm not really interested in writing that character. But the third point of view character, Lucy, at age 27, has been a rape survivor half her life. Long before Harvey Weinstein's crimes became public, I knew that Lucy had been raped by her mother's boyfriend. I understood also how this secret trauma was central to the core of her identity. What I hadn't fully understood until Me Too was how her need to find someone she trusted enough to tell about her trauma was central to the plot of the story, not just to her storyline, but to that of other characters, Bill most especially. Bill's journey from aging party boy to potential ally of a rape survivor depends upon his ability to see how his own sexual desire is complicit in Lucy's re-experiencing of that earlier trauma. In order to love her, he has to overcome his obsession with her. Okay, another challenge in writing about sex is how to write about the scenes, or how to write the scenes themselves. What language to use. Me Too also got me thinking a lot about the importance of verbal consent in those scenes, and also how even with explicit verbal consent, the moment may not be mutual. Also on explicit language, I forget who I heard say this. People have sex, body parts don't. Sex scenes should focus on the relationships between people, not their appendages and orifices. That said, the body is the vehicle for that kind of intimacy. I'm reading now for the first time one of my wife's favorite novels, Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. It's wonderful, dark, sexy, and in the late 19th century, for many people, scandalous. And yet, when I came to the scene when Anna and Vronsky, after flirting heavily for a year and for many, many pages, finally have sex, for about a half a page, I wasn't sure what had just happened. As the great Greek tragedians did with violence, Tolstoy observes the decorum of keeping the sex off the page. I'll see if he continues to do so for the next 600 pages. By contrast, a couple of decades later, we have Henry Miller in Tropic of Cancer dropping the C word, not cancer, over a dozen times in the first 5 pages. Pages and pages devoted to careful description of the physical act of sex, until, at least for me, it gets a bit tiresome. In The Skin Artist, I probably fall somewhere between the two. Not to compare myself to Henry Miller, and certainly not to Tolstoy. But it's a hard balance to strike. My goal has been to achieve a solid R rating, not PG-13 and not XXX. Speaking of XXX, I recently came upon a debate over Henry Miller in the New York Review, New York Times Review of Books, between Erica Jong and Elaine Blair, who had previously published a critique of Miller. And Jong responds by saying, Miller was trying to open up the territory of sex to modern writers. Many writers in Paris in the 1930s took aim at our puritanical society and tried to open up ways of telling the truth about men and women and lust. We are not minds without bodies, and our bodies often surprise us. You can't throw out an entire literature of the body by taking a censorious approach to human behavior. He inspired so many writers who wanted to understand how mind and body interact. In her reply, Elaine Blair said, I too like Miller's work, and I don't want to see him hustled off the stage over broad, unexamined charges of misogyny. But I don't think it's sufficient to say, as Ms. Jong does, that Miller's sexual frankness was simply telling the truth about men and women and lust, and taking aim at our puritanical society. Yes, he does very much seem to relish flipping off any notions of sexual propriety and respectability, and this can be thrilling and hilarious, to me at least. And as I mentioned in the piece, he can be romantic, but for one thing, he gives no sign of perceiving a crucial aspect of sexuality. To put it simply, one person's expressions of sexual desire can impinge on another person's freedom. This impingement may be accidental or it may be intentional. This was something that Miller couldn't see, or more accurately, he didn't recognize a potential moral problem in it. And when I read that, I thought that is precisely one of the moral problems I hope that my novel does address.